There is one object in the world on which the name Israel is written in Egyptian. It is a slab of black granite, taller than a man, and it stands in a museum in Cairo. It was carved to celebrate a military campaign, and Israel appears in a single line near the bottom of it, almost in passing, as one of several peoples a pharaoh claims to have beaten in the field. It is the oldest mention of Israel anywhere outside the Bible, and it says nothing whatever about an escape from Egypt. That is the difficulty of tonight's subject, set out in 3 sentences. Here is the ground we are going to walk tonight. What Egypt actually wrote down about Semitic people living in its delta, in its own records and in its own hand. The 2 cities the book of Exodus names, and what has been dug up where they stood. The argument about the date, which is not a small argument. The numbers, the route, and the sea. And then the honest question underneath all of it, which is what the silence of Egypt is actually worth. We will go gently. There is a great deal of noise attached to this subject, from people certain in both directions, and we are going to leave nearly all of it outside the door. Start with the stone, because it is the fixed point that everything else has to be arranged around. Flinders Petrie, the English archaeologist who was digging at Thebes in the winter of 1896, found it lying face down in the ruins of a mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile. It had been carved for one pharaoh, taken, turned over and reused by another, which was ordinary practice. Petrie had it lifted and read that evening. The text is a victory hymn. It lists the enemies the pharaoh has crushed, in the way that Egyptian monumental writing always does, which is to say generously. The line that matters is near the bottom of the stone, and in English it is 5 words long. Israel is laid waste, its seed is not. Petrie is said to have understood at once what he was holding. This stone, he told his dinner guests that night, will be better known in the world than anything else I have found. That stone is dated to about 1208 years before Christ, in the 5th year of the reign of a pharaoh named Merneptah. And the little sign the scribe attached to the word Israel, the mark Egyptian writing uses to say what kind of thing a name is, does not mark a city or a country. It marks a people. So here is what the only Egyptian mention of Israel actually tells us. Around 1200 years before Christ, there was a people called Israel in Canaan, substantial enough that an Egyptian king thought it worth boasting about defeating them. They were already there, already a people, already worth naming on a monument in the same breath as fortified cities. Which means that whatever happened in Egypt, and whenever it happened, it had already finished happening by then. And here is the question this whole story comes down to, so put your answer in the comments before you hear mine. If Egypt kept no record of the Exodus, does that silence count as evidence against it? Or is it exactly what you would expect from a kingdom that never wrote down a defeat? See whether you still think the same thing by the end. So we begin where the book itself begins, which is not with an escape at all. It begins with a family arriving in Egypt because there is food there and none at home. And that part of it, the arriving, is the part Egypt wrote down over and over again for 1,000 years. Egypt was the granary of the eastern Mediterranean. The Nile flooded whether or not the rains came in Canaan, and the rains in Canaan failed regularly. So people walked south and west, through Sinai, in small family groups and larger tribal ones, in every century for which we have records, looking for grain and grazing. There is a tomb at Beni Hassan, cut into a cliff above the Nile, painted about 1890 years before Christ, and on its wall is a procession of 37 people arriving from Canaan. They are painted with beards and with brightly patterned cloth, quite unlike Egyptian dress, and their leader is labeled in the hieroglyphs as a ruler of a foreign land. They have brought eye paint to trade. They have donkeys and children and a man carrying a lyre. It is an ordinary scene of an ordinary event, painted by an Egyptian for an Egyptian tomb. That painting is 400 years older than any date anyone proposes for the Exodus. It is simply what the Eastern Delta was like. Manfred Bietak, the Austrian archaeologist who has spent most of a working life digging in one field in the Eastern Delta, has excavated the city underneath it. The place is called Tel El Daba now. In the second millennium before Christ, it was called Avaris, and it was not an Egyptian town in the ordinary sense. Its houses are built to a Canaanite plan. Its dead are buried in a Canaanite way, with weapons, sometimes with donkeys laid at the entrance of the tomb, which is a Levantine custom and not an Egyptian one. Its pottery is largely from the Levant. Its temples are laid out to a Syrian pattern. This is a Semitic city inside Egypt, and it grew over generations until it was one of the largest settlements in the country. In a garden beside a palace there, the excavators found a set of tombs, and in one of them the smashed remains of a statue larger than life. It shows a seated man who is not Egyptian. He has red hair cut in a mushroom shape, a throw stick held across his shoulder in the manner of an Asiatic official, and a coat painted in bands of color. The statue had been deliberately broken, and the tomb was empty. Whoever he was important enough to be honored with a monument, and then important enough for someone to want the monument destroyed. Now a caution, because this is exactly the point where this subject usually goes wrong. That statue is not Joseph. Nobody serious says it is Joseph. What it is proof of something quieter and more useful. It shows that a foreigner from Canaan could rise high enough in Egypt to be given a statue and a tomb in a palace garden. The situation the book of Genesis describes was possible. The Semitic population of the Delta grew until, sometime around 1650 before Christ, rulers of Canaanite origin held the whole of Lower Egypt. The Egyptians called them the Hyksos, which means rulers of foreign lands, and they governed from Avaris for something over a century. Then, about 1550 before Christ, an Egyptian dynasty from the south drove them out, chased them into Canaan, and besieged them there. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century after Christ, quotes an Egyptian priest named Manetho on the expulsion of the Hyksos, and then argues that the Hyksos were the Israelites. Almost nobody follows him in that today. The dates are wrong, the numbers are wrong, and the direction of travel is wrong. But Josephus is evidence of something else worth having. It tells us that Egyptian tradition itself remembered a large Semitic population in the Delta, and remembered it leaving under duress, some centuries before the period we are actually looking at. There is a papyrus in the Brooklyn Museum that is simply a household list, and it is one of the more moving documents to survive from the ancient world. It records the servants attached to an estate in Upper Egypt in the Middle Kingdom. It gives each one a name, a job, and a nationality. Of the 95 servants named on that list, more than half are Asiatics, which is the Egyptian word for people from Canaan and Syria. They are cooks, brewers, weavers, field hands, tutors for the household's children. and they have Semitic names written out in Egyptian letters, one after another in a clerk's careful hand. One of those names is Shiphrah. That is also the name of one of the two midwives in the first chapter of Exodus, the two who are ordered to kill the Hebrew boys and quietly decline to do it. The papyrus is much older than any Exodus date, and the woman on the list is not that woman. What it shows is that the names in the biblical story are the names real Semitic servants in Egypt actually carried. That is the kind of evidence this subject usually offers, not proof of the event, confirmation of the world the event is set in. There is a tomb at Thebes belonging to a man named Rechmiah, who was vizier of Egypt about 1450 before Christ, and one wall of it shows how the state got its building done. The painting shows foreign laborers making mud brick. They are drawing water, mixing mud with chopped straw, pressing it into wooden molds, turning the bricks out to dry in rows, and carrying them away on shoulder yokes. Standing over them are Egyptian overseers with sticks, and the inscription beside the scene has one of them saying that the rod is in his hand and the workers are not to be idle. That is the 5th chapter of Exodus, painted on a wall by an Egyptian in the 15th century before Christ, without any awareness of the Bible whatsoever. It is worth saying clearly that these are not Israelites. They are laborers from Canaan and from Nubia in a state-building program, doing exactly what the book describes being done. And the straw is not decoration. Egyptian mud brick used chopped straw as a binder, and when Pharaoh in the story punishes the people by making them gather their own straw while the quota stays the same, that is a real Egyptian production system being described accurately. There is also a papyrus in Leiden, an administrative note from the reign of Rameses II, which instructs an official to issue grain rations to the soldiers and to the Aperu who are hauling stone for the great gateway of Rameses. Foreign laborers on the Rameses building program drawing rations. That is the world the book of Exodus opens in, described from the other side, by the people running it. And there is one more place where these two worlds touch, and it is the strangest of them all. In the mountains of western Sinai, there is an Egyptian turquoise mine called Serabit el-Khadim, worked for centuries by gangs brought in from Canaan. Cut into the rock around it, and dated to something like 1800 before Christ, are short inscriptions in a script nobody could read for a long time. They turned out to be Egyptian picture signs being used in an entirely new way, not as pictures and not as syllables, but as single sounds. A house sign for the sound, be an ox head for the sound A. That is an alphabet. It is the earliest one anybody has found, and it was made by Semitic-speaking workers in an Egyptian mine, borrowing their masters' signs and using them for their own language. Every letter on this screen descends from those scratches on a mine wall in Sinai. The alphabet the Hebrew scriptures would eventually be written in was invented by Semitic laborers inside the Egyptian system. A border official on the eastern frontier wrote a report that has survived, and it is one of the most quoted documents in this whole field, for good reason. He writes that they have finished letting the tribes of Edom pass the fortress in Tijeku to the pools of Piratum in order to keep them alive and to keep their cattle alive. That is a routine dispatch from an Egyptian civil servant, written about 1200 years before Christ, describing shepherd people from the east being admitted through a border fort to water their animals in the delta. The book of Exodus describes shepherd people from the east living in the delta and pasturing their animals there. The dispatch does not prove the book. It shows the book knows what it is talking about. And it names a place, Pithom, which brings us to the two cities the book actually names, and to the only piece of hard geography in the whole account. The first chapter of Exodus says that the Israelites were set to work as builders, and that they built for Pharaoh two store cities called Pithom and Rameses. Pithom, the place in the border officials report, is Pithom. The name means the house of the god Atum, and it sat in the eastern delta on the route in from Sinai. Rameses is the more interesting of the two, because there is only one city it can be, and we know a great deal about it. Rameses II came to the throne about 1279 before Christ, and he reigned for 66 years, which was long enough to rebuild the map of his own country. He moved the capital of Egypt to the eastern delta, to a site next to the old Semitic city of Avaris, and he named it after himself, Rameses, the house of Rameses. The city he built covered something like 4 square miles, with palaces, temples, barracks, stables for hundreds of chariot horses, and industrial quarters turning out weapons and glazed tile. It was one of the largest cities on earth in its day, and it was built where the Semitic population of Egypt had lived for centuries, using the enormous labor force such a project needs. And here is the detail that matters more than any other single fact in this episode. Rameses did not last. The branch of the Nile stood on silted up. Within about 200 years, the city was abandoned, and its stone was carted away and reused to build Tanis, 12 miles to the north. By the time of Solomon, it was gone. By the time of the prophets, it was a memory. By the Roman period, nobody knew where it had been, and the ruins at Tanis were assumed to be it until the 1960s. So when the book of Exodus says the Israelites built a city called Rameses in the Delta, it is naming a place that was only called that for a couple of centuries, in the second millennium before Christ, and which was then lost for 3,000 years. That is not the kind of detail an invented story picks up. A writer in a much later century would have said Tanis, because Tanis was the Delta city everybody knew. And that is where the argument about the date begins, because the two named cities pull the story in one direction, and a number in the Book of Kings pulls it in another. The first Book of Kings gives a number, and the number is 480. It says that Solomon began building the temple 480 years after the people came out of Egypt. Solomon's 4th year can be fixed, within a few years, to about 966 before Christ. Add the 480, and you arrive at 1446. That is the early date, and it has the great virtue of being what the Bible itself says. It puts the Exodus in the 15th century under a pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. The difficulty is that there was no city called Rameses in 1446. Rameses II was not born for another century and a half. Kenneth Kitchen, the English Egyptologist who spent his career on the period, and who defended the reliability of these texts as strongly as anyone alive, argued for the other date. He put the Exodus in the 13th century, around 1260 or so, in the reign of Rameses II, which fits the cities, fits the border reports, and fits the picture of Delta labor. And he read the 480 as a figure of style rather than a count. 12 generations of 40 years, 40 being the round number the Hebrew scriptures use for a lifetime of adult service. 12 generations, counted honestly, run nearer to 300 years than 480. That would put the Exodus almost exactly where the archaeology puts the building work. Others hold to 1446 and argue that the name Rameses in the text is a later editor's clarification, a scribe updating an old place name so his readers would know where it meant, which is a real practice, and we can watch scribes doing it elsewhere in the Bible. Both positions are held by serious people who are not trying to deceive anybody. What both positions agree on is the ceiling. Whatever date you choose, it has to be earlier than that black stone in Cairo, because by 1208 the people were in Canaan and an Egyptian king was boasting about them. Now the numbers, because they are the single largest obstacle in the account, and it does nobody any good to walk past them. 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. That is what the 12th chapter of Exodus says left Egypt. 600,000 fighting men implies a total population of about 2 million people, which would have been something like a third of the entire population of Egypt at the time. A column of that size, walking 10 abreast, would stretch back well over 100 miles behind its leaders, which is most of the distance from the delta to the mountains of Sinai. They would need water for 2 million people and their animals every day, in a desert that supports a few thousand Bedouin at a time. And when they arrive, the book says they camped in one place, Kadesh Barnea, for the greater part of 40 years. A camp of 2 million people leaves a mark on the ground. Kadesh Barnea has been excavated. There are fortresses there from the 10th century before Christ and later. From the 13th century and from the 15th, there is nothing at all. So either the number means something other than what it seems to mean, or the account is not describing what it seems to describe. Those are the two honest options. There is a serious philological case for the first. The Hebrew word translated thousand elif is the same word used elsewhere for a clan, a family group, or a military squad under a captain. Read as squads rather than thousands, 600 elif becomes 600 fighting units, and the total falls to something in the low tens of thousands. That is a size a desert can carry. It is a size that leaves little trace. It is also, awkwardly, a size that requires the received text to have been misunderstood by its own copyists at some early point. Nobody has settled it. What can be said is that the number is a translation problem before it is a credibility problem, and that the two are constantly confused in public argument. And while we are clearing the ground, there is one document that has to be set aside, because it is quoted at you constantly, and it will not bear the weight. It is called the Ipuwer Papyrus. It sits in Leiden, and it is a long poem describing Egypt turned upside down. The river is blood. The land is without light. The servants have taken what their masters had. You can see why it gets used. Read quickly, in the right mood. It sounds like the plagues written up by an eyewitness. But the text is a known literary form. Egyptian scribes wrote laments about the collapse of order the way later writers wrote elegies, and this one is copied from an original several centuries, older than any Exodus date on offer. It is not a report, it is a genre. And a case that has to lean on, it is weaker for the leaning, which is why the serious defenders of these events leave it alone. Then there is the sea, which is the part everybody knows, and where the English translation has done real damage to the discussion. The Hebrew of the book does not say the Red Sea at all. It says Yam Suf, which is the Sea of Reeds, and suf is the ordinary word for the reeds that grow in fresh and brackish water. Reeds do not grow in the Red Sea. It is deep, salt, and clear. They grow in the marshes and lagoons of the eastern delta, which in the second millennium before Christ formed a chain of shallow lakes across the entire land, root out of Egypt. The translation as Red Sea comes down to us through the Greek of the 3rd century before Christ, and from the Greek into the Latin, and from the Latin into every European language including our own. That does not settle the geography either, because the same Hebrew phrase is used elsewhere in the Bible for the gulf that runs up towards Aqaba, which is genuinely part of the Red Sea. But it changes the picture. The crossing the Hebrew describes may be a crossing of a marshy lake system in a strong east wind, in a landscape where the water level genuinely does move with the wind. Now hold on to one line in the 13th chapter, because it is the most quietly impressive sentence in the whole account. It says that God did not lead the people by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near, in case they saw war and turned back. The way of the land of the Philistines is the coast road north out of Egypt. The Egyptians called it the ways of Horus, and it was the military highway to their empire in Canaan. Archaeologists have been excavating it. It was a chain of fortresses and wells, a day's march apart, garrisoned, with a major fortress at the frontier itself, and it is shown on the wall of a temple at Karnak with the forts drawn one after another. An escaping labor force could not have used that road. It ran past a garrison every few hours for 200 miles. The book says they went the other way, into the wilderness, precisely to avoid soldiers. And the archaeology of that road says that is the only choice that makes any sense. Again, that is not proof. It is a detail of military geography, dropped in one clause, that turns out to be exactly right for the period in question and wrong for later ones. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel, and there is a new one every day, walking through the life of Jesus. Israel Finkelstein, the Tel Aviv archaeologist who has argued the skeptical case as clearly as anyone, puts the counter-argument in a form worth stating properly, because it is not a lazy argument. His position is that the Exodus narrative as we have it was shaped in the 7th century before Christ, when Judah was a small kingdom under Assyrian pressure and looking over its shoulder at a resurgent Egypt. He points out that several of the place names in the wilderness itinerary were occupied in the 7th century and not in the 13th, and that the story of a great deliverance from Egypt was exactly what a 7th century audience needed to hear. That is a serious case, and it deserves to be heard without flinching. It does not require anybody to be lying. Traditions get written down in a particular century, and the century they are written in leaves fingerprints. The answer usually given is not that Finkelstein has his facts wrong, but that the fingerprints of the 7th century sit on top of something older. Because the core of the story is not a 7th century kind of story. And this is where we come to the heart of tonight's question. So what does the silence of Egypt actually amount to? It is the strongest argument the skeptics have, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a comfortable one. Start with what Egyptian monumental writing was for. It was not history in our sense. It was theology carved in stone, and its subject was the divine order of the world with the pharaoh at the center of it. Not one Egyptian record anywhere admits to losing a battle. Not one. In 3,000 years of inscriptions, there is no defeat, no retreat, no plague that beat the king, no disaster the gods did not intend. The clearest example is the Battle of Kadesh, fought against the Hittites about 1274 before Christ. Rameses II nearly lost his army in an ambush, and the campaign ended in a stalemate and a treaty. He carved it on at least 5 temple walls as the greatest personal victory in Egyptian history, with himself alone in his chariot, scattering the enemy. We only know what actually happened because the Hittite version survives too, from the other end of the empire, in a different language, on clay. So a kingdom that turned a draw into a triumph on 5 temples was never going to carve an account of a slave population walking out of the delta while the army failed to stop them. And Egypt did not only decline to record its failures. It went back and removed things it had already recorded, which is a harder habit still for anyone hoping to argue from silence. When Hatshepsut, who had ruled as pharaoh for 2 decades, was some years dead, her images were chiseled off the monuments and her name cut out of the king lists. When Akhenaten moved the capital and the religion, his successors pulled his city down, ground his temple blocks into rubble, and used them as filling inside their own walls, and left him off the record entirely. That is a state that treated its own written past as an instrument. Things that did not fit the order of the world were not merely unmentioned. They were unmade. And that is before you reach the ordinary attrition of 3,000 years, of stone quarried for later buildings, of tombs robbed, of temples burned, of papyrus eaten by damp and insects and time. Then there is a plainer problem, which is that the delta is wet. Papyrus survives in Egypt because Upper Egypt is bone dry and the tombs are cut into desert rock. The administrative archives of the delta cities, the day-to-day paperwork of the very region this story takes place in, have rotted into the mud. They are simply gone. We do not have the Egyptian records that would mention this, because we do not have the Egyptian records of that region at all, on any subject. And the scale question cuts both ways. If the group that left was a few thousand people rather than 2 million, it would have been, from the Egyptian side, an administrative annoyance in a frontier province. Egypt lost runaway workers regularly. We have the reports. One papyrus is a frontier officer's account of chasing 2 escaped servants into the desert, written in the same century, in the same region, in the same tired official prose. None of that proves an exodus happened. It does mean that the absence of an Egyptian record is worth much less as an argument than it first appears, and this is the thing most worth taking away tonight. Merneptah, the son of Rameses, ruled for about 10 years, and his stone remains the only Egyptian text that names Israel at all. Consider what that means. If Egypt only ever mentioned Israel once, in a boast about beating them in Canaan, then the volume of Egyptian writing about Israel was never going to be large in any scenario. There is one more body of evidence, from the century in between, and it comes from Egypt, but it is not about Egypt. The Amarna letters run to about 380 tablets, found in the ruins of an Egyptian capital, and they are diplomatic correspondence in Akkadian from the 14th century before Christ. Most of them are letters from the rulers of Canaanite cities to the pharaoh, and most of those are complaints. The roads are not safe. My neighbor is disloyal. Send archers. Again and again, they blame a group they call the Aperu or Habaru, who are attacking the towns, taking the hills, and being sheltered by rival kings. The Habaru are not a nation. The word turns up across the Near East for centuries, and it describes a status rather than a people. Displaced men, outside the city system, hiring out as labor or as fighters. The resemblance between Hebrew and the word Hebrew, Ibri, has been argued about for 100 years, and the linguists have not settled it. The two words may be related, they are certainly not simple equivalents. What the letters do show is a Canaan in the 14th century in which the Egyptian hold is weakening. The hill country is filling with people outside the city system, and the local kings cannot stop it. And that is the century before the stone in Cairo says there is a people called Israel in that country. Here, then, is what is actually known, set out plainly, with nothing added in either direction. Semitic people from Canaan lived in the Egyptian delta in large numbers for centuries. That is not disputed by anybody. It is in the paintings, the pottery, the burials, and the household lists. Some of them rose high in Egyptian service, and some of them were held in it. Egypt used foreign labor on state-building projects and wrote down the fact without embarrassment. A city called Rameses stood in the eastern delta for about 2 centuries and then vanished from memory, and the book names it correctly. The northern road out of Egypt was a fortified military highway, and the book says the route avoided it for exactly that reason. By about 1208 before Christ, there was a people called Israel in Canaan, distinct enough for an Egyptian king to name. And there is no Egyptian text describing an exodus, which is what we should expect from a state that never recorded a loss, in a region whose archives have rotted away. That is the whole of the evidence. It is not nothing, and it is not proof, and anybody who tells you otherwise in either direction is selling something. It is also worth noticing what is not on that list, which is a mountain. Where Sinai actually stood is a separate question with its own evidence, and we have given it its own night. What remains is the story itself, and there is one thing about it that no archaeology touches, and it is the reason this account has held for 3,000 years. No other nation in the ancient world wrote its founding story this way. Every people around them began their history with gods, heroes, and kings descended from the sun. Israel began its national story by saying, "We were slaves, we were nobody, we were a labor force in another country's brickyards, and we were brought out." That is not a story a people invents to make itself feel important. It is not the sort of past anyone chooses. It is the sort of past you are stuck with, and then decide to build on. And the way it was kept is stranger still. It was not kept as a monument. It was kept as a meal, eaten once a year in a house, with the youngest child at the table asking why this night is different from every other night. Egypt wrote on granite and lost the delta archives to the mud. Israel wrote on the memory of families, and it is still being recited this year in kitchens on every continent. Which brings us back to the question we started with, and to the fairest answer that can be given. The silence of Egypt is real, and it is not an accident of scholarship. But it is the silence of a state that only ever spoke about its victories in a region whose paperwork is gone. You will not settle this with a spade. What can be said is that everything the book gets a chance to be checked on, the cities, the names, the roads, the border reports, it gets right for the period it claims. That is not faith. That is just what the evidence looks like when you set it out without shouting. And the rest of it, the part about being brought out, has never been an argument about Egypt. It has always been an argument about whether anybody is listening, when people in a difficult place cry out. There is a last detail about that stone in Cairo that is worth carrying to bed with you, because it turns the whole thing round. Merneptah had it carved to say that Israel was finished. Israel is laid waste. He had cut into the granite, its seed is not. That was the official position of the most powerful state on earth. It is the only sentence Egypt ever wrote about them, and it was wrong. The people it declared extinct went on to outlast the dynasty, the language, the gods, and the empire that carved it. 3,000 years later, the granite sits behind glass in a museum, and the name on it that anyone still recognizes is the name of the people it was announcing the end of. Sleep well. We will pick up another one tomorrow.